Yeah, I kind of sort of see what you're saying. You're basically like effort becomes the currency, kind of, right? Okay, so like my guess is going to be something like where you say like how useful is a rule if the rule is like it's a good thing for society to fill up your car at this gas station, but only if your car is blue, was manufactured in 2017, and if you do it on Wednesday or whatever. Like if a rule has
Sure,
so many
something like that.
qualifiers, yeah.
Have you seen kind of what's happening with Nick Fuentes and Charlie Kirk?
But I think like it's an absurd number. It's like 40 or 50% of audits or whatever, I think, or some crazy percentage of audits are for people that take the earned income tax credit. I think that if I was to give an argument for why we need rent control now is because of the immediate benefits, that's what I would give. But that actually feels more just like people fucking hate landlords and they're just trying to find a way to
All
like
right, yeah, I
punish them.
mean, this is just how I would personally go about dealing with the problem of zoning and the problem of low-income people not having sufficient access to housing.
Stop intimidating.
Okay, that was pretty dumb. Ayo.
One thing that I thought was kind of interesting about the participatory economic thing,
Mm-hmm.
when I was thinking about it, I read the same thing that you did.
Oh yeah,
So
I noticed you said
yeah,
that in chat as soon as I started to give out some of my criticism, or when I mentioned that I'd read like a 25-page thing on it. You're like, oh yeah.
well, I mean, I read it like the same day because like I saw the things like, oh, I wonder if there's
Mm-hmm.
any like easy critiques. So like let's say that everything's like set up.
Mm-hmm.
So you have like your balanced job complexes, you have some way of measuring effort.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you do it, but let's just say you can do that. And then like you have all of the infrastructure in place so that you can easily sort of set up your like, this is what I want for the year, and you send it out and it gets, sent back to you.
Yeah.
So let's say this happens like normally within like a normal fiscal year, so like 365 days.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing really that says that it has to be like 365 days. That's just like, like it's just like how long it takes for the Earth to go around the sun. There's nothing like inherent about that that says we have to sort of peg our economic cycle to that, right? So like let's say under our par econ system, we have a fiscal year of 200 days,
Okay.
and then let's say that we obtain like even better computers
Mm-hmm.
and we bring it down to 100 days,
Okay.
and the computers get better and better and better, and we make it 50 days, 10 days, 5 days, and eventually we bring down the entire cycle where you put out your little quota for the day, you put that out in one day, and then let's say we shorten it even more, such that it is the shortest it can possibly be, that being like one work day. So like everybody goes to work, after they work, they have their effort put in, and then they put in their production quotas. So what I think would happen in this case is essentially you have like real time, so effort would essentially just become a unit of account instead of money, and then you would essentially have supply and demand and prices becoming imputed because you're just doing everything so fast. So it seems like if you just do everything quickly enough, what happens is that the sort of like the feedback just happens in real time such that it looks like a market. Does that make sense?
Kind of. Yeah, I kind of sort of see what you're saying. You're basically like effort becomes the currency, kind of, right?
Yeah, so
In a
effort
real.
becomes the
Yeah.
currency. And then instead of
Although.
just like all of your stuff
Mm-hmm.
coming in one year, it just comes in as soon as you like whenever you want, like as soon as you have the currency essentially.
Sure.
So
We're
so
ignoring
and
the
in
fact that it's like it seems impossible to like actually
right,
quantify
of
effort
course,
of
of
it.
course.
But yeah.
I'm just saying, like in
Mm-hmm.
his idealization, it seems like you're just coming to a market with extra steps, where because everything gets produced so fast, they can take that feedback instantly, so they know what they're supposed to produce,
Yeah.
for like the next day or whatever, and this just becomes like supply and demand, and then
Yeah.
effort just becomes like a unit of account instead
Yeah.
of like a dollar or whatever.
I kind of noticed that people that want to change that I guess you would say like that mode of production, that people that want to have like things made not based on market forces but based on like actual planning, that as soon as people acknowledge that there are problems with that, all the steps they take to remedy those problems basically arrive at a less efficient market. Like that's what it seems like.
Yeah,
Well, we're
exactly.
going to
Because like
essentially
you
plan
always
it,
get
but we're going to
feedback
take into
mechanism.
account like what people want. Well, how? Well,
Yeah,
maybe we'll pull them and see what they're willing to work for. Okay, this seems.
right, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. It just happens again and again.
I'm really
Um,
curious. I've kind of wanted to run through. I'm lazy, so I'm too lazy to design the analogy. But I've kind
yeah,
of wanted to run through with one of these guys, like give him like a whole hypothetical. It's like, okay, well, let's say we set up a system where like people could work for a certain amount of time, and then they would take like the blue collar hours worked, and then they would go to a store and maybe they would account for like, hey, these are the 3 hours that I've worked with my honorable blue collar job. I'd like to trade in these 3 hours for a product that like a committee, or like something like basically like design a market and
yeah,
see if
yeah,
they'll
yeah,
agree to it. Like, okay, like we'll just replace this shit with currency. And like you're literally there. Like, why the fuck don't you just do a market? Yeah, because that seems to be like what
yeah,
everybody says. Yeah,
yeah. It's very weird.
yeah, but
I
whatever.
don't know, not a fan. I had like a few questions about just kind of surrounding all this N-word stuff. Um, I had some questions about how you do like your rule utilitarianism. Not like any questions about the sort of N-word
Yeah, go for it.
controversy in general. So when you're making your rule, is like, do you think at all about like the margin of rule precision when a rule becomes too complicated, such that like it loses meaning or applicability or usefulness? Like, should we consider the compactness of a rule when we're sort of developing them?
Um. Okay, so like my guess is going to be something like where you say like how useful is a rule if the rule is like it's a good thing for society to fill up your car at this gas station, but only if your car is blue, was manufactured in 2017, and if you do it on Wednesday or whatever. Like if a rule has
Sure,
so many
something like that.
qualifiers. Yeah. So I would say that like specific rules are probably okay, but I would say that like any specific rule is probably specific, but the specificity doesn't come from the rule itself, but probably draws on other principles. So like we can use like the private joke thing as an example, right? So like I would say
Sure.
like you should probably be able to use private jokes in public so long as you're aware that your friends are like not sufficiently racist, and then also as long as you feel like your mind is adequately guarded against like certain types of social pressures, and then as long as you're engaging with humor in a responsible way. And then it seems like we're starting to stop. We're starting to add on like a lot of things. Like okay, well at this point like this seems like so specific. This rule seems worthless. But then I would argue that for each of those things, we're probably drawing on like general principles to arrive at these rules, such that the rule like almost logically follows from other things. So for instance, like engaging in responsible humor with other people, that's like something that applies to a lot of different things. That's not just like a personal friend thing, right? Like this applies to satire as well as like public humor and all sorts of other things as well. Or the idea that like you should guard your mind against being indoctrinated by certain things. Well, this applies to like watching other types of media. So like I listen to a lot of Fox News, or I used to, and like Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck. I listen to these people on a daily basis just because I was really interested in what the other side thought, but I don't think I was ever indoctrinated by it because I was very socially aware of what was going on. So yeah, I would say like even if a
Sure.
rule seems kind of specific, it's drawing from general enough principles that like it's okay that there's like a specificity surrounding said rule.
So like kind of rephrasing that,
Yeah.
would you say like you'd want kind of like a nexus of other rules from which you can kind of intuit these like more specific principles? Like just
Almost, or like the opposite of what you said. There's like a
okay,
nexus of general principles that you could intuit these specific rules. I think that there would be like
okay.
you would have like some central body of principles, and then from there you can just kind of like generate rules naturally. Like oh well, this would logically extend from this, or this would logically extend from that. Yeah.
How do you balance the like the notion of these principles,
Mm-hmm.
like sort of their correctness and their goodness against like the sort of idea of like utils or like good generated from a utilitarian perspective?
Well, I mean, like, as much as I shit on REM, to some extent, some of these things are incommensurable. So it becomes like an arbitrary bullshit, I guess, at the end of the day, to some extent. So, for instance, if I were to value my autonomy against somebody else's, I guess, happiness,
Hmm.
it becomes pretty hard to weigh some things against other things. I
Yeah,
guess I would have to think of like the specific principle, or the specific rule or whatever, or the action. I'd have to try to weigh it against each other. Um,
sure.
yeah, although with the private public language thing, that feels like I don't actually have to do that. Like if somebody were to make a demand of my private time, I would just say that demand is full stop unreasonable, period. I don't even think I would have to weigh anything there. That's kind of one of the reasons why I disregard that incommensurability there, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, I
yeah.
was just kind of curious.
Yeah, sure.
Personally, my stance is that like you should say the N word in public, but not in private to shield your loved ones from the harshness of the word. But
Okay,
we differ in that respect.
sure.
Um, just another random thing. Have you seen kind of what's happening with Nick Fuentes and Charlie Kirk?
No, what's going on? Is Fuentes
So
siphoning off Kirk's racist fans or something?
kind of what's happening is Charlie Kirk is doing like his usual kind of speaking tour bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happening is because he's like this kind of traditional conservative who's like
Yep,
pro-Israel and like, oh, legal immigrants, but not illegal immigrants.
kind
What
of.
happens is, yeah, kind of like, he still wants to dramatically kind of cap that
Yeah, well, I
and
was
all
gonna say
sorts of
because
stuff.
Kirk appeals a lot more to populism than traditional conservatives. Like Charlie Kirk will
Oh,
come out and be like anti-corporatism and stuff, which
oh,
traditional
sure. So
conservatives, yeah,
he's on that level, but
yeah.
Nick Fuentes is like even further in that direction. So what's been happening is people who are like sort of Nick Fuentes aficionados,
Mm-hmm.
like fans of America First, have been coming to these talks and asking him some like really uncomfortable questions. So they'll ask a question, they'll be like, hey, like, what do you think of the USS Liberty incident? Or they'll ask like questions about demographics. So there's just like all of these clips popping up online
Mm-hmm.
where he's just being forced to ask questions by like racist Nick Fuentes fans and being forced to contend with the fact that like his movement from the inside is like being eaten by this sort of like white nationalist surge. It's actually really funny
Yeah.
to see like how uncomfortable he is to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
So like there was one where like he was with one like a token sort of like gay black conservative,
Okay.
and one dude came to the mic and he asked the question. He's like, "How does anal sex help us win the culture war?" And it's like massively awkward for Kirk to even attempt to answer any of these questions. It's pretty, I don't know, it's pretty interesting to see
Yeah.
like finally sort of the right eating itself and stuff like the left eating itself. But I don't know, it's just a weird phenomenon.
Yeah, it's really weird to see those guys because they're cowards, right? Because what actually is happening is I think they're aware that they're getting those extremist fan bases, so they try not to talk about those specific things or answer hard questions there because they don't want to kind of push those people away. I think that's what it feels like to me
Oh
sometimes.
no, yeah, no, I mean I definitely agree. There have been like
Yeah.
numerous scandals where sort of TPUSA people have been revealed to be like, white nationalists or just deeply racist in some way. And I think that's like a substantial proportion of the group. And the only reason people have kind of latched onto it is because like it's a good avenue for like collective action. Like it's useful for organizing, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not really on board with the whole like with the ideals espoused by somebody like Kirk.
Yeah.
Back to the Burgess stuff. So I guess just to summarize, what he said was you guys were talking about universal versus targeted programs, specifically like welfare stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and he made the claim, or like he put forward a hypothesis that universal programs were going to be more popular because they
Mm-hmm.
covered everybody, and therefore much more difficult to cut back or much
Yeah.
more difficult to sort of retrench
Yep. And to be
because
clear,
of that sort of
to be fair to
broad
Ben,
support.
that's not a hypothesis. That's actually just a fact. If we use inference to the best reasons. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
but I don't like.
I'm just
I don't
kidding.
know.
Okay, sorry.
Like, yeah, I know. I'm just like, yeah. So he put forward the hypothesis, and he seemed to have the prior that this was just a correct thing, since he had seen no evidence to the contrary. And I
Yeah.
guess it's kind of easy to like sort of pluck out examples, like, oh, look at these countries that have universal healthcare, and they haven't like eliminated it, so
Mm-hmm.
presumably like it's pretty difficult to eliminate things like that. So you kind of countered with like, oh, I mean, we don't actually know if that's the case. There's just like these big sort of cherry picked examples you can pull up, and even if it were the case, we don't know it's for the reason that you're saying.
Yeah.
So I kind of spent some time and I looked at like the sort of back and forth on the universal versus targeted welfare discussion, and it turns out, surprisingly, shockingly,
Mm-hmm.
that you're actually correct. That there isn't really any like there isn't anyone that's better than the other. It's very much down to things like path dependence. So
Path
I guess like
dependence
starting
meaning what?
like path dependence, like let's say, so Denmark is like a good example, which uses like a lot of sort of targeted welfare, but they have like very good coverage. It's a very effective program. It's very resistant to retrenchment,
Mm-hmm.
and because like they started out with that, they were able to like sort of build this into like a very strong program. So like essentially, it's just based on like the political circumstances that take place in the country, those that took place in the past, sort of like the political culture that has developed over time.
Mm-hmm.
Which much there's like it's much harder to say that there's some kind of broad or general rule that you can
Yeah. Okay.
talk about with respect to universal or target welfare.
And that's like, it
So
was really irritating that he was trying to use that inference to the best reason when I felt like my hypothesis was even more explanatory than his. Although obviously without like tests, we can't determine that. But it's like,
sure,
it seems reasonable for me to assume that like, well, if a program is universal, it must be like pretty popular before ever even becoming universal. Like it's hard to imagine there was like some slightly unpopular program that got all the way to being universal because those things require so much more funding and then
yeah,
became popular. Like that seems like really hard to implement, but yeah.
yeah, you describe it as like an endogeneity problem where it's unclear whether the universalness is what made it popular or whether it's
It
like popular
became,
because it's universal. Like it's unclear
yeah.
sort of which comes before the other.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I guess just to like go through the history that I could find
Mm-hmm.
about this subject. So in 1994, you start with claims by a guy named Pearson, who found that means-tested benefits, so targeted programs, actually enjoyed some benefits over universal programs during Reagan and Thatcher, which is pretty interesting because that's like the sort of period when you'd expect retrenchment to be sort of particularly intense within the United States and the United
I'm just
Kingdom.
gonna take a guess. When you say retrenchment, does that mean like
Yeah,
undoing
just
like
like cutting
social
back,
programs? Yeah. Okay.
cutting back. Yeah.
Sure.
So this is reflecting the success of something that the UK had called the family credit and the US's earned income tax credit.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing here, the arguments that he puts forward in favor of sort of targeted over universal programs during this era is that universal programs provide serious competition to private sector alternatives, which of course is really unpalatable to people like Reagan and Thatcher.
Mm-hmm.
And there's very little spending to cut from means tested programs in the first place compared to universal ones.
Mm-hmm.
And like some people might push back against this, but these parties, conservative parties, do actually care about perception when it comes to things like, how cruel they're being. Like, are they, cutting back benefits for the poor too excessively? Does this make it less difficult to sort of exercise the political capital that they have?
Is it going to make it harder for them to win elections? Are things that
Right,
everybody keeps in mind? Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And then on top of that, if you do sort of cut back means tested programs, what you end up with is a situation where stricter means testing means more bureaucracy, because you have to be able to sort of more specifically single out individuals. It becomes more challenging to do so. Yeah, exactly. So under Thatcher, you had attempts to cut means tested programs, but it ran into like huge political problems. Again, that like perception of cutting benefits to the poor, compared to like this very small sort of decremental targeting of universal programs. And Reagan's plans targeting means tested programs essentially just lost steam by 1982. So sort of very early on, they run into these overwhelming political obstacles to cutting means tested programs compared to universal ones. And the problem here is that like successful retrenchment, like if you do manage to cut these programs, you need to reduce the perceived severity of the cuts, which requires something like a substitution of private alternatives, or just like doing it very, very slowly. And this wasn't really possible for means tested programs because there wasn't a private alternative. And it's really hard to go like really, really slowly when you're talking about programs that are already very small and target a very visible like part of the population, that being the poor. And actually you find that like in the UK, the impact, so the proportion of spending with respect to means tested programs actually grew under Thatcher. And in the United States, just I guess to sort of also look at how it grew there. In 2013, the CBO found like means tested programs have been growing pretty consistently by about like 6% on average since 1972. So there hasn't been like some kind of big like they stopped growing. Like they've just kind of consistently been expanding. That isn't to say that they were like never successfully challenged or that they never faced a period of retrenchment, but they haven't really been stunted in any way. And like as an example, you could consider the EITC expansions in 1986, 1990, 1993, 2001, 2009. And then there's
real quick question on the EITC thing. The way that the IRS like audits that shit is ridiculous, right?
Oh, it's absurd. Yeah, they because Republicans want like EITC quotas,
accountability. Yeah.
Quotas.
Sorry, just
yeah,
so in case you didn't know for chat, I might be off my numbers here, but I think like it's an absurd number. It's like 40 or 50% of audits or whatever, I think, or some crazy percentage of audits are for people that take the earned income tax credit. Because people are worried that people are going to cheat their taxes. But it's like, it's such a stupid misuse of wielding the IRS as a tool to increase like tax receipts, because people that are on the earned income tax credit aren't making enough fucking money to like be worth going after. And there are like billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, I believe, in outstanding tax revenue that the IRS just doesn't have the resources to go after. And instead there is like a quota of earned income tax credit recipients that they have to audit in order to make sure people aren't misusing that credit. It's insanely stupid.
Yeah, it's very dumb. Yeah, I don't know. It's really terrible. But like then, even so, on top of that, there are state level expansions that are going on. So the EITC on the federal level has been expanded, and on the state level, it's been expanded despite this sort of really hostile outlook. Like in addition to that, you have another really troubling problem, which is that sort of tax preparatory agencies filter out through low income neighborhoods, and they actually manage to capture a substantial proportion of the EITC through the fees that they charge lower income individuals. So that's kind of like an insidious avenue through which you can find.
Oh, so you get basically a tax revenue collecting place that realizes it can bump up rates a little bit because they're probably going to, because a lot of these places, I remember this back when I was poor, if you pay some of these people to do your taxes, they will, they'll actually send you, I think they pay you your money up front, but they take some of it when it comes in, like a higher portion of it or something. Or they've got like repayment schemes like that or something, where like they'll automatically handle the refund for you, but then they take like a cut of it, or like a bigger cut than
you. So this is like a perennial problem with respect to like, I don't know, essentially the way that taxes are done in the United States in general, because we have a lot of lobbying from groups like TurboTax or whatever, so the government just doesn't kind of automatically do it for us, which they probably should.
Which they do in like most European countries. You just get a form saying this is what you owe in taxes. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. And then just like this Pearson work from 1994, the same sort of thing about the 1980s, this decade that I guess would be associated with things like sort of not necessarily austerity, but kind of like cutting of welfare, increased privatization, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
This conclusion has been sort of separately confirmed by other scholars, Robert Greenstein, Christopher Howard. Um, so it's not like sort of a one-off thing. This is like a pretty well-established phenomenon.
Hmm.
And then, so you have that in 1994. Then in 2007, a guy named Nelson looks at 18 of the OECD countries from 1991 to 2002. And he kind of looks to see whether sort of universal or targeted programs experience more retrenchment during that period. And he finds that from 1991 to 1993, means tested benefits are less vulnerable. But then from 1994 to 2002, universal benefits prove to be much less vulnerable to retrenchment. So this would kind of go in favor of what Burgess was saying.
Hmm.
But the problem is um, there are a lot of problems. Essentially, it varies a lot, not only between different countries, but also within countries. So,
Hmm.
for instance, one of the ones he brings up is Italy, which has like a huge sort of split between the North and the South. And there's also a lot of devolution regarding things like welfare administration. So you'll find that the wealthier northern regions are much more effective at sort of resisting things like cutting or whatever compared to the probably more corrupt, less effective regions in the South.
Hmm.
You'll also find that old age pensions are the most resistant compared to means tested benefits. And I
Yeah.
would kind of object to calling those universal benefits. I
Yeah,
think
because
you
they're
did the same.
age gated. It's a little weird. Also, I don't
Yeah.
believe like based on my on like a pretty easy understanding of psychology, people have a really hard time dealing with deferred rewards. So I have a
Yeah.
hard time believing that a 30 or 40-year-old would vote heavily in favor of like Social Security or some other program that they can't collect on for decades. If they would vote in favor of that and then get rid of something more immediate, I have a hard
Yeah.
time believing that. Yeah,
I think I would attribute the popularity of programs like this to the sort of political mobilization
of
of
old
like really
people.
old people. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a
exactly.
voting age thing.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so just to give some examples of like this heterogeneity in difference for like means tested versus universal programs in Canada, means tested benefits have experienced really major cuts. In
Hmm.
Denmark, like I mentioned, they have become much more generous over time.
Hmm.
And like I mentioned before, this is like a matter of path dependence of resistance to retrenchment. So like your political evolution matters, the way your country develops matters. So like the vulnerability of means tested benefits is going to be higher where they've most eroded. So like if you have a history of means tested benefits being cut, what that is probably going to mean in the future is that means tested benefits seem to have a higher chance of getting cut like they did in Canada.
Hmm.
So this kind of suggests that overall universal benefits appear to be slightly more resistant to retrenchment.
Hmm.
But realistically, if you kind of look at the graphs here in Nelson's work and you look at like how it changes over time and how it differs between countries, it's a very like shaky conclusion. It's like
Sure.
not
Or
really
it's
something
more,
that you
it
can
seems like
extract
it's
in general.
probably, yeah, more likely that there's like different political situations or political climates
Right,
at the time are
exactly.
going to be more impactful here than just saying that, like, oh, this is this or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
one interesting thing here, he criticizes the previous person's argument, Pearson's argument, talking about how means tested benefits are like a very small amount, so it's difficult to justify cutting them. He says that while they are a small amount on the federal level, on the regional or state level, for instance, they comprise a larger proportion of local spending,
Hmm.
so they would probably be more vulnerable to cutting in that instance. Though
Hmm.
this is kind of just a like a suggestion or a hypothesis. It's not actually sort of um, robustly tested.
Hmm.
And then finally, 4 years later in 2011, you have Kenworthy who writes a book and he summarizes sort of all of these findings and he demonstrates that sort of means testing is just as, if not more, resistant to budgetary cuts than universal programs. He looks at Nelson. He says, like, again, this isn't really very conclusive. It's hard to draw sort of a general conclusion here. So from this perspective, you could say that universal versus targeted welfare, it's kind of a wash. There's not really a difference. It really depends on your circumstances. It's a very country specific or even region specific thing.
Yeah, sure.
So then after that, just another way that we could assess these programs is by looking at how effective they are. Like, putting aside how often they are, they are cut, how much they experience retrenchment. We can also examine sort of how effective are universal versus targeted programs, which is going to run into sort of similar problems regarding like, between country comparisons and sort of how difficult it is to sort of extract like a general conclusion from this.
Hmm.
But going over the history of that, in 1998, we have two guys, Corpy and Palm, who do some research surrounding those 18 OECD countries,
Hmm.
and they find this concept called the paradox of redistribution.
Hmm.
So this is like the sort of foundational concept that they establish. The more you target your benefits, the less redistribution you achieve. So they come out strongly in favor of universal programs, suggesting that greater targeting entails less redistribution and less reduction of poverty. So universal programs are found to be more closely correlated with redistributive efficacy. And the argument here is that universal programs increase redistributive budgets and the larger budgets increase redistribution. So that's what they find. This conclusion has been like absolutely trashed as time has gone by. So Kenworthy, who I mentioned before, he looks at this same relationship. They wrote this in 1998, so he looks at it in 1980, 1985, 1990, 1995, 2000, 2005. And he finds that from 1980 to 1990, what they're saying seems to sort of hold true for the most part. Universal programs appear to be more effective at sort of redistributing. But by 1995, the correlation gets really, really weak. And then once you look at 2000 and 2005, after Corky and Palm, it completely sort of disappears. Like there is no distinction between targeted versus universal benefits in terms of the success or efficacy of redistribution. And again, like obviously these are just correlations because it's very difficult to do like a comprehensive comparison.
Causal thing. Yeah, here, sure.
Yeah, exactly. And this change, Kenworthy notes, can be attributed to essentially single country changes, which highlights again the sort of heterogeneity of welfare between countries. So like Denmark's sort of major shift towards targeting by the 2000s can be attributed to the way that redistribution has shifted dramatically. And then I think that this gets even more substantially sort of blown out of the water by Peter Whiteford in 2008, who says that once you look at the household position after taxes and transfers, so instead of prior taxes and transfers, you look at things after taxes and transfers, universalism actually has like a strong negative correlation with redistribution, and sort of targeting is much more effective, which kind of completely overturns Corky and Palm's work.
Why is that? Because it's looking at like the before and after status of people that receive said redistribution?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, exactly. So it's looking like after taxes are taken and after transfers are provided, what does the actual distribution look like? Has redistribution been more successful under these programs? And he finds the exact opposite that Corky and Palm do. And I personally would argue that in terms of methodology, you probably want to do after taxes and transfers. And then again, in 2013, you have some other scholars, Marks, Salinowskate, and Verbist, who find that Corky and Palm's empirical findings no longer hold, kind of like Kenworthy found. So like, from 2000 onwards, this sort of correlation either flattens or reverses depending on sort of how exactly you measure things, how exactly you do, whether you do things like prior or after taxes and transfers. And also things shift kind of when you talk about like the type of benefit, the country, and then also your data source. So like what data set you're using regarding income. So like obviously there's a whole bunch of data sets that sort of calculate income over time, like the Luxembourg income something, I don't remember. The LIS and the SILC are two of the sort of acronyms.
Okay.
And you find that like between data sets for income, essentially things shift around. So it's like a pretty shaky conclusion either way. So like how incomes are classified, the inclusion or exclusion of tax information, all of these things play a very strong role in determining what exactly your correlation is going to look like. And targeted programs are now stronger because they aren't only targeted at those who are out of work, but they're seen as gateways as well. So like this is a thing that has been like really instrumental in strengthening the political sort of steadfastness of these programs. So like EITC in the US, RSA in France, or WTC in the United Kingdom, these are like the EITC equivalents, are seen as like gateways out of poverty, instead of just like, helping people sort of subsist on this sort of minimum standard of living. Then you have just, I don't know, there's a lot of evidence that also suggests the redistributive welfare effects of targeted programs are really good for like child poverty versus universal programs.
Okay.
And then I guess just a comment I'd have in general with respect to developing countries. I assume Burgess was talking mostly about like, developed countries and what we should do there. But I think that in developing countries, it's probably worth noting that I think targeted benefits are probably going to come off better for these countries that have like sort of low levels of bureaucracy. Like even though they have like low levels of bureaucracy and might struggle to sort of administer benefits, you have this trade-off where you either give small transfers in your universal program. So you can do that, or you can avoid, and this avoids the exclusion error in targeted programs, so like people who might fall through the cracks because your bureaucracy is shitty because you're a very poor country. But like on the other hand, targeted programs will be able to target the ones that don't fall through the cracks much more effectively. And they find, people find, Hannah and Olkin, 2018, find that on net the targeted programs improve welfare more. So despite this sort of drawback of people falling through the cracks, you still have a situation in developing countries where targeting the welfare is more effective at reducing poverty. And of course, with things like better technology will come better data and a superior ability to sort of administer these targeted welfare programs. And then, of course, in countries in Africa, it's really interesting actually, because you kind of get to look at a continent like Africa and you get to see the countries within it that are sort of trying to build up welfare states, and you kind of get to see like what exactly is the process that a country can take to effectively maintain and nurture its welfare state to provide for a country that is like still very much trapped in like the bottom rungs of global poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these programs are actually targeted, and the way that they kind of get out of the problem that like Burgess was highlighting, where universal programs could potentially have greater political support, is they take the targeted funds and they allocate them to villages, and the village councils will then sort of determine how these funds are going to be distributed. So they have like kind of a stake in it, they have skin in the game, so they're not going to be opposed to it because they've come to like a strong consensus within this sort of tribal or patriarchal sort of substructure that exists below the state, which I think is pretty interesting. Yeah, so that's just the stuff regarding universal versus means-tested programs. Just like a few final notes. It's definitely worth noting that there's like a lot of stigma and complicated application processes when it comes to targeted programs. Like, people might not even apply to targeted programs simply because it makes them look poor and they don't like how they're perceived in that respect. So I guess that's worth keeping in mind. Work requirements don't work. Like they're a pretty cancer quote unquote solution to making these programs help sort of jettison people back into the labor force. They increase cognitive costs, they reduce slack, or like the time that people have to sort of organize their day and take care of more vital tasks. And they also sort of promote these harmful narratives that feed into the stigma I described before. So like these ideas about people who are lazy, or people who are lazy are the only ones who are on this program or whatever, we have to force them to work, and that can in and of itself sort of prevent people from actually applying for these kinds of programs. I guess just some notes about the EITC. It's a good program. Like you said, there's this huge problem with respect to auditing. The IRS has also been sort of improperly issuing payments. There's a lot of problems within the IRS bureaucracy when it comes to the EITC. Like I said, tax preparation agencies are able to capture a substantial amount. Here I have the amount. It's like up to a fifth, so that's, pretty substantial, like 20% of the EITC benefit. And recently, interestingly, there's been some doubt cast on whether or not the EITC actually incentivizes work, which is apparently one of its biggest selling points. Why it has like in some sense like some level of bipartisan support, that you can say like, oh, look at this, it actually gets like poor people to work, they're not lazy, woohoo. But some doubt has actually been cast on this much lauded thing. Like the line that people sort of pull out is like, oh, single mothers increase their participation in the labor force because of the EITC. The paper that came out recently that sort of is contesting this hasn't yet been like peer reviewed or finalized.
It's a working
but it is
paper,
like,
whatever, sure.
Yeah, exactly. But it's still like a pretty sort of interesting thing to think about, that this could be overturned. Nevertheless, I think there's still like an enormous slew of benefits to the EITC. I don't think that the fact that like it doesn't sort of increase labor force participation rates like sinks the program or whatever. There are positive maternal health outcomes. There are positive educational outcomes. It's effective in reducing poverty. Like it still boosts local economies. Like it's not a sunk program just because of this sort of question surrounding whether or not it boosts labor force participation among single mothers, which is a pretty narrow benefit.
That's a pretty specific thing.
Yeah. But again, like in terms of political viability, this is like one of the things that's trumpeted with respect to the EITC. Like, people love their sort of I guess like niche minorities that they can use to say like, oh, look, this program benefits this group of people that everybody loves, whether it's like small business owners or single mothers or whatever. So in that sense, they're like, I guess it's like a fairly cherished supposed outcome of the EITC. I guess some notes on universal welfare. I thought it was really weird that he compared the ACA and the NHS, because like the ACA is not a universal program. They've tried to cut it a bunch. Or not cut it, they've tried to repeal it a bunch, and they've just failed every single time. And the best they were able to do with like absolute sort of domination was just zero out the individual mandate. And like it's unclear, and like people are now saying like, oh, that might lead to the ACA itself being struck down. I don't think that's the case. I think there's like some pretty robust defenses in that regard. But then like you look at the NHS, and under Thatcher you had the establishment of this sort of quote unquote internal market within the NHS that sort of created like a collection of incentives and market structures that were meant to make it work more effectively. And then Blair maintained this, and then the conservatives in 2012 increased this marketization rate. And some of these things have produced negative outcomes. I can't really speak to like whether or not it's overall been absolutely positive or absolutely negative or whatever. But there's like a lot of perception of like, privatization is taking place in like these small sort of segments of the NHS, and like the marketization is this sort of ever looming, this ever looming like gorgon that people are worried about or whatever. So it seems pretty strange to suggest that like, oh, look, this program is totally fine. It's the NHS, like it's totally steadfast. Everybody loves the NHS. But despite that, like cutting isn't the only bad thing that can happen to a welfare program. Like reforms can still sort of shuffle things around in a way that is markedly negative.
Yeah, this same kind of fight is happening with education in the United Kingdom as well, where it was completely and totally like free for lower income people, but then they've started to add premiums onto it, and initially that produced better outcomes, but now the premiums are starting to climb up, and people are worried that they're going to become prohibitive once again for like poor people. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, like exactly, like cutting isn't the only sort of bad thing that can take place, and like I guess like the meme thing is that now with Brexit, like Trump has come out and said that the NHS is on the table for a trade deal. So he's gonna force flash privatization.
Yeah.
Probably not really, but it's interesting to suggest that like, oh, the NHS is this indomitable behemoth. Look at the ACA with its sort of non-universal measures, and look at like it's been, the mandate's been zeroed out, it's done, it's finished. When I just don't really think this is the case. One weird thing that he said is he kind of pushed back on this notion that Social Security will go bankrupt. It's not really that Social Security is going to go bankrupt, but like the trust fund is arguably going to become depleted by like the early 2030s, which is a concern. So we have to kind of, I don't know, do something about that, increase some sort of taxation, change the way that Social Security is administered, change the retirement age. I don't know, something like this. I think it's kind of odd that he just said that wasn't the case. I think it's probably arguably because this notion that like the trust fund is going to become depleted within like, I don't know what, like 15 years or so, is often used to sort of agitate for privatization, like it was in 2005 under Bush. So I can understand like rhetorically why he would push back against that claim, but like I don't think that privatization is really the only solution to this problem.
Sure.
So that's the stuff with respect to the universal versus targeted welfare that he spoke to you about. And then this kind of spilled over into the rent control and public housing debate. I think it's really interesting the way that people are talking about Bernie's proposals. So the way that I kind of want to structure that, if that's okay, is like just kind of talk about his proposal and then propose like some alternatives, like explain why I think his proposal has like some challenges or issues or flaws. So I would note that like his proposal is rent stabilization, which is kind of a distinction from like sort of those flat rent caps. So like there's a distinction between first generation, which are these absolute caps on rent, versus second generation bounds on rent increases.
Wait, real quick. Let me summarize real quick because somebody asked. So what is this guy's personal conclusion? Does he think means-tested welfare programs are better than universal ones, or was it just his opinion? Just depends. Basically, so Ben Burgess made the argument that like universal programs, a lot of people make this argument against me actually. A lot of people make this argument that means-tested programs are more likely, are more susceptible to retrenchment. The idea that they can be withdrawn in the future or they can suffer cuts, whereas universal programs are more unassailable. That these are like established and people can't do anything against them. But that doesn't seem to be true. Like sometimes universal programs are harder to take cut back. Sometimes means-tested ones are harder to cut back. Like it's probably more related to the political climate or the popularity of any such program at the time in any given country, rather than like it's universal so it's harder to attack, or it's means-tested so it's harder to attack. That assertion just doesn't seem to bear out in reality. That we can find like one or two examples where it might be true, but we can also find just as many on the other end.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right.
There's a distinction to be noted between the first generation notion of rent control, which is an absolute cap, and the second generation of rent control, which is a sort of floating bound, which is what Bernie's proposing. He's saying like it can only increase by, I think it's like 3% per year, 3% or some other measure, whichever is higher, is the amount that it can increase per year, which is very distinct from saying like, all right, it can only be like $1,000 a month. That's flat. That's it. That's all it is. And like I'm not a fan of this, but he caps it at 3% or the CPI, whichever is higher. And the fastest growing rents in the country are like 6 to 8%, and that's like those are the fastest growing, like the top echelon. So I don't know if this is like I'd have to do more digging, but I don't know how much this is actually going to sort of moderate the increase of rents in like America at large. Like I can see how it might impact certain cities where this problem has become really exacerbated, but I'm not positive if it's going to really take a dent out of like the problem that rent increases are posing elsewhere. So one interesting thing, I think it's such an interesting rhetorical like offensive, this idea that you can say like and I think you might have mentioned this like last night or something, that you can say like, oh, rent control, we can do rent control and we can couple it with public housing and everything will be totally fine. And it's like, well, why do you want the rent control? It's like, we have public housing, it's going to be totally fine. Like, what are you talking about, dude? And it's like, well, why not just do the public housing? Or like, why is the rent control even necessary? And I think
Do you know the
the
answer to
arguments,
that?
well, I would say that it's because people believe that the best way, that like tenants need protection now, essentially, like they need to be prevented from being thrown out of their apartments immediately. Like,
Okay.
and
I
and
feel like that's not why. I feel like people just really like. I think that if I was to give an argument for why we need rent control now, is because of the immediate benefits. That's what I would give. But that actually feels more just like people fucking hate landlords and they just want to find a way to
all right,
punish
yeah, I
them.
mean,
Yeah, that seems to be
that's
more the
totally
case.
possible. I guess like if I want to be charitable, I'd say like I think the reason is probably that people are concerned about the short-term outcomes for tenants. But the problem is, and they say like, oh, all of these sort of gaps that rent control causes will be sort of filled in by public housing. But I think that there's some problems with this perspective. Putting aside like the goodness of rent control on its own, rent control plus public housing isn't like sort of a panacea to all of the problems posed by rent control on its own. So like first of all, you have a distinct sort of misallocation between tenants and units because people don't want to give up a rent controlled unit. So you have actually, hold on, let me just think for a second. No, that actually shouldn't be a problem. My mistake, because misallocation wouldn't happen if you had like universal rent control. Like regardless of where people are moving, everything should be like people aren't going to be like, oh, I want to stay in this rent controlled unit
Okay.
because all of the units are rent controlled. So my bad on that. Sorry. But like another problem, for
Oh, because
instance,
you're talking about like a universal rent control, like Bernie's
yeah,
universal.
sorry.
Okay. Okay.
It was kind of like when I was researching this, it was kind of hard because every single critique about rent control that wouldn't be solved by public housing, I had to make sure that it still applied when you had like nationwide rent control. So like I don't know, it kind of got a little confusing. So you have a problem of housing overconsumption, of course, which I think you've brought up a few times. And then here's kind of an interesting thing. You have a potential decay of housing stock due to a lack of incentives to sort of repair. Bernie's plan allows rent stabilization, so he sort of says like you don't have to follow the rules of my rent control program if you make significant quote unquote capital improvements.
Oof.
But the problem with this is it's kind of unclear what the scope of these improvements is.
Yeah. How do you
And
measure that?
it's like a binary, like it's either like exemption or no exemption, versus like kind of a scaling amount of exemption or something. So there could be like some perverse incentives at the margin depending on how improvements are assessed. Like I don't know, maybe you do like the bare minimum or whatever, and this leads to like a rash of like
There's
bare
like some
minimum
whole market
improvements
that
across
opens
the
up for
country.
some companies that give like the bare minimum requirement.
Yeah,
Like this
I
is
don't know.
literally like the Bernie rent control escape construction crew or some shit where it's like
Right,
if you
exactly,
add
like,
like
I
a
don't know.
giant spinning fucking fan on top of your thing that looks nice, you can escape the rent control provisions or some shit. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. So it's like, and obviously I'm not going to say like, oh, $1 trillion industry is going to spring up overnight about this, but it's just something to consider that like there could be some potential wonkiness around this margin of like what exactly constitutes a sufficient improvement to obtain the exemption. And then here, this is the weirdest thing to me. This is very strange. People say like, all right, rent control will prevent new homes from being built in the cities where people want to live, and people are like, all right, that's fine, we'll build a bunch of public housing. Bernie's plan says we'll build a bunch of public housing. It's like, yes, it does say that, but the question is, where does it say that public housing is actually going to be built? Because the implication is that we're building public housing where it's being demanded. But the reality is, if you look at the report that his sort of number, 7.4 million affordable units, is sourced from, it's actually targeting a sort of specific deficit that is calculated like on a state-to-state basis. It's not like a fluctuating thing like, oh, 1 year, if more demand for houses in general appears in this city, we're going to build a bunch of public houses. It's more like for the extreme low-income people in the country, this is how many units we need in each state. So
But
it's
if
not
it's
as
like
if
in
like
California, because of like San Francisco and LA, if we start building a bunch of housing like in central California, it doesn't really do much for us.
right, but like even more so, like consider like let's say that there's a huge demand. Like if you can go and look in the report and you can look at the map, it's like what if there's a whole bunch of demand for like public houses in like Iowa or something. It's like, well, that's not really where we need to build them or
Hmm.
whatever. Like it's not, sorry, not demand, but like if there's a shortage there, because this is like a static thing. It's like here's the shortage that we found this year, and this is what Bernie is addressing. He's not addressing demand for housing. He's addressing a specific static shortage that was found in terms of low income housing. This isn't something that means he's going to be able to like, he's going to sort of toss up a whole bunch of houses when demand starts sort of spiking in like in cities like San Francisco or whatever. It means that he is intending on building public housing for extremely low income individuals in the states where it is currently necessary.
Hmm.
So the problem posed by rent control of new houses will not be built is not resolved by Bernie's uh, public housing program. He also says he plans on building about like, I don't know, somewhere between like 1 to 2 million other public houses, other public homes, but this isn't like this isn't sufficient really to solve that the shortfall in supply that rent control would cause. So I think this is really interesting because obviously, like you can say, oh, the problems with housing shortages will be solved if we build a whole bunch of public houses whenever a bunch of public housing whenever demand skyrockets in one of these superstar cities. And it's like, well, sure, but that's not actually what his plan is talking about. His plan is talking about addressing this specific shortage. And I thought this was always, I don't know, I thought this was really, really bizarre. Um, and then another thing with respect to that sort of uh, what that that margin, that weird margin of capital exemption.
Hmm.
So in San Francisco, something that happened is a similar situation was there where you could like sort of renovate your home a whole bunch and you would be exempted from rent control. So people built like a bunch of really high rise luxury, not high rise, a bunch of luxury condos instead of apartment units, and they got exempted from rent control and they made a whole bunch of money. And what they ended up doing is it fueled gentrification massively in San Francisco.
Hmm.
So I think what you're going to end up with if you have this weird sort of margin where people can have exemption from the rent stabilization is that you could potentially see the growth of gentrification in some of these large coastal cities because people will just do the sort of bare minimum improvement and transform their apartment units that were previously sort of rent stabilized into these luxury condos for which they can charge a lot more. So I think that's also sort of relevant to think about. Um, Another thing, so Sanders' plan does actually address zoning problems, and he does this by making the receipt of certain types of federal funding contingent on zoning reform. So I think this is, basically all of the Democratic candidates are proposing something like this. The idea where you're going to take community development block grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and you're going to say like, all right, you need to do some zoning reform if you want to receive these grants, and like that's fine and all. I think it's potential you could have like some thorny political issues between local and federal government, um, local and federal government leadership or whatever. There could be like a little bit of friction there.
Hmm.
That's fine though. I think this is a viable thing. The problem with that is you have to look at like who actually receives the community development block grants in the first place. And the reality is that the CDBG basically goes to cities that aren't like the worst in terms of zoning. So like if you want to sort of tackle the zoning problem head on, you
Hmm.
can't do it using this incentive that provides funds to cities that don't have the worst zoning problems.
Yeah,
Like
that
you
these are
want
already
to
cities that are positioned well in like a free market to kind of solve
right,
their
exactly. So
problems.
like
Yeah.
if you're just like taking away CDBG funds from like these smaller cities um, that have that like rely more on them. Like that's fine, you can do that, and they'll probably sort of reform their zoning issue, but it's not really going to solve the problem like at all really because these aren't the cities that are seriously experiencing like the cities that are experiencing this problem are really wealthy. They're massive cities. They're like huge global tech hubs, global
Hmm.
finance hubs, that kind of thing. Like they don't need the grants from the HUD, which is so that's just a relevant thing to take into consideration. More margin problems. Sanders doesn't exempt vacant units or new units, which is a big thing that a lot of rent control policies do. Is they say like as soon as something goes vacant or as soon as a new unit is built, it is not immediately subject to rent control.
Hmm.
Sanders' plan doesn't do that. He just has this capital improvements concept. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. So in general, I don't like the idea of a policy that's sort of equally subsidizing someone's right to live in like San Francisco and like Gary, Indiana. I guess this is just like a moral feeling that I have, but I don't think that those two locations should be equivalently subsidized. Like people are receiving the same level of rent stabilization, whether you are like a very well-off individual living in one of the best cities in the country or somebody very poor living in a very shitty city. I don't think these two groups of people deserve the same same tenancy protections. I think that there's something to be said for like, I don't know, just justice in that respect. I don't know. I don't really like that. I think that's kind of gross, but whatever. That's not really like founded in sort of hard policy analysis. Let's see. Hold on. Yeah, one thing that I really do like from Bernie's proposal, which I think is something that others. This is actually funny. This is where the real Democratic primary horseshoe emerges, because Delaney is supporting essentially the same thing. The idea where you have a right to counsel, so tenants with incomes below 200% of the federal poverty line, who are facing an eviction in housing, have court access to an attorney, which I think is like a good thing. Like if you are a very poor individual and you are being evicted, having a sort of being provided legal representation, I think is a very I don't know. I think it's a very positive development, and this is something that has been tried in New York City, and it's been pretty successful. Evictions have declined faster in sort of in the zip codes that. Sorry, hold on. Yeah, so essentially this has protected people from like unjust evictions pretty transparently, which I think is pretty much a good thing. And I think this is like I like this because it's a good alternative to the problems posed by rent control. So if we take like our good faith rent control advocate who is saying like I want short-term protection for tenants, I think that right to counsel is like a much more palatable option because it doesn't come with these potential issues of gentrification emerging because of incentives on the margin. It doesn't come with these issues of not enough new housing units being built because we're focusing on low-income units in all sorts of parts of the country instead of the cities that really need new housing construction. And it's really easy to sort of administer this and buoy it from like a federal perspective because you can provide. So Sanders' plan provides $2 billion in federal matching grants for states and localities. So essentially, like for every dollar that you provide for your RTC, the federal government will match that. And I think that's a really positive development. I think that's something that's worth preserving. From Sanders' plan, Delaney supports a similar model, though, as you might expect, he's dumping less money into it. One interesting note, I think a lot of people talk about like luxury housing. They say like, oh, if we let the market do it, they'll just build like fancy luxury housing. And it's like, so the problem with this is that it doesn't actually matter. Like it's just totally irrelevant because of something called filtering, where the idea is if you build a quote unquote luxury house, what will happen is that people from sort of middle to upper income people will move out of their houses, move into the luxury houses, and their old house will become freed up for low income people.
In a closed system, I would agree. In a rental market, I don't think I would agree with that, just because
this is I'm bringing this up not as like a theoretical thing. Like this is a robustly supported thing, like empirically. Like it's the notion of filtering within housing.
Wait, but even in like ultra high demand markets like LA, like the filtering thing, I could 100% see happening in markets that don't have a huge influx, like a huge external pressure. But like in LA, for instance, let's say you open up like a whole bunch of like high quality apartments. Even if people moved from here to those apartments, like there's still so many people from the outside trying to get in that I feel like market prices wouldn't really change much on the vacant units. Like you wouldn't really need to lower the rents on those because there's still so many people from the outside trying to get in. No.
Well, the result. So I haven't seen any specific results that like talk about LA specifically, but I can send you like a bunch of stuff about this notion of filtering. So like even if you build a luxury house, you're still going to be, like you're not like preventing. You're not bringing down prices. Like this is still going to have an impact on prices. This is still going to provide housing for people. I don't know. It's just a really interesting quirk. It's not something I would have.
Well, I can understand like the filtering absolutely. Yeah, filtering absolutely makes sense in a closed system. Like if you open up really expensive apartments, then the demand, if there are people that can afford to pay more, then the demand for those will fall as those people will filter into higher apartments, causing the units in the middle prices to fall as the number of people chasing them will be less. Yeah, but my only problem is like if there are theoretically. Like let's say that you have like 1,000 rich people, 1,000 middle class people, and 1,000 poor people all trying to move into a city. That if that city filters some middle class people into higher apartments, all of the people from the outside are still trying to come in, and the market prices may not change much at all just because of that. That would be my wonder, I guess. And in ultra high demand places like LA or San Francisco or stuff like that.
It's possible, but again, like what I've seen empirically, this doesn't really happen to be the case. Like I'll send you some stuff afterwards.
Sure.
If you want to look over it, but essentially like filtering proves to be like a pretty robust a pretty like robust thing that happens when you talk about luxury housing, which I always thought was, I don't know, like I mean like you, I was initially skeptical. Like it seems pretty difficult to believe that this would be a thing that consistently emerges, but the luxury housing critique I don't really think holds much water. But I guess that's just like a thing to consider.
Sure.
I'll send you some stuff and you can like decide for yourself
Okay.
what you think. And then just some alternative policies to consider in terms of like targeted policies, and then in terms of housing. Just because I might have brought this up to you before in like chat and stuff, is I think it's really good when you have like a specific alternative to recommend when somebody puts forward a policy. So you're not just criticizing it, you're also like talking from a position where you can say like, consider that we should do this, and this is how this resolves the problem better than like what your thing does. I think that's like a really strong rhetorical thing. So the EITC, obviously like there's the whole basic notion of expanding the earned income tax credit. So that's definitely a thing you could do. There's a proposed reform called the cost of living refund, which expands the EITC enormously. It makes it phase in dollar for dollar with earnings, so it actually phases in much faster than the normal EITC does, which is a sort of persistent criticism. The so-called like you see a lot of sort of leftist policy analysts, people like Matt Brunig, who sort of criticize this trapezoidal shape of welfare programs like the EITC, saying that it like the phase-in is just totally unnecessary. Like, why would we even have this phase-in? So the cost of living refund, the idea here is that it phases in dollar for dollar, and it sort of lessens the impact that you're. It lessens like the troubles that you have like with this sort of much slower phase-in. Then it sort of expands the EITC, because there's a few groups that probably should receive the EITC that don't. So like workers without children at home who are under 18 should probably be eligible. The maximum eligible age of 64 should probably be removed. Like there are a few tweaks here and there you can make. Also things like students and caregivers who qualify as working, so like low-income students and caregivers who are technically working but might not actually be registered under the EITC should probably be sort of scooped up into that system. And then there's also the idea of sending out like pre-populated forms to people who are eligible, which would kind of escape this problem of people not applying to the EITC, people not knowing like how to apply to the EITC, the
Kind
tax
of sort of making it an opt-out instead of an opt-in.
Right,
almost,
exactly. You just send them a form, and it's like everything's already done for you. You just got to sign off if you want it, and you should be good. And obviously, you'd expect this to sort of increase participation to a greater extent. And then there's something proposed by another economist, Dubé, or however you pronounce his name. I don't know how to pronounce his first name because he's Indian, which is the earned and basic income tax credit, which would just phase in, like in the basic system here is that your phase-in starts at a proportion of your maximum benefits. So in the cost of living refund, you have a maximum of $4,000 to single workers, and the idea is that you just start the phase-in at $2,000. So you never have a situation where somebody is like trapped in a position where they're receiving zero from the EITC. People are always receiving a sort of minimum income so long as they like qualify. So I guess this kind of almost makes it into a sort of not quite a UBI, but like a negative income tax-ish kind of situation. This is just how I would personally go about dealing with the problem of zoning and the problem of low-income people not having sufficient access to housing. And I personally, like, obviously, since like I mashed together a few different policy proposals, I think this is kind of elegant, but I don't know. I just think this is a really compelling way to sort of address the problems versus something like a broad rent stabilization program and then like a sort of public housing program that doesn't really resolve the issues with that. Housing choice vouchers, so Section 8 housing choice vouchers, if I don't know if anybody's familiar with those, they provide a subsidy to landlords of low-income families. Some like 20 million people qualify for HCVs, but they don't actually receive them. So not everybody who qualifies for Section 8 actually receives it, which is a huge problem. Sanders proposes expanding this to everybody who is eligible. I broadly agree with this, but I'm going to differ slightly on how I think it should be paid for and how I think it should be administered. So HCVs are, I don't know, it's really good to know stuff about HCVs because it's a really effective way that you can target people who are low income and struggle with housing. So they don't reduce housing consumption by like increasing prices or anything. So that's like an empirical result that people find regarding HCVs. Extending them to everybody who's eligible would cost about $410 billion from 2015 to 2025. So over a 10-year period, it costs about $41 billion on average per year.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is a lot. Like you could say like, oh, 41 billion, it's not that much money. It's kind of a lot of money. So like, how would you pay for that? So here's a proposal that I read, which I think is really, really compelling. You abolish the mortgage interest deduction. Do you have any like pre-existing opinions on the
Yeah,
MID
mortgage
or?
interest deduction is horrible. Probably needs to
Yeah,
go. It's
exactly. Yeah,
massively regressive. Yeah.
exactly. So $70 billion per year. So, um, out of $41 billion per year to expand the Section 8 to everybody who's eligible. $70 billion a year from the MID. So you just sort of uh, cut the MID dramatically and you shovel that into the Section 8 program. And obviously, it's worth noting the MID doesn't actually promote home ownership. It's enormously regressive. Lots of economists want to abolish it.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem, the flip side of this, is that for whatever, well, actually not for whatever fucking reason, it's kind of obvious. It's enormously popular. It's one of the most consistently popular programs in the country.
Of
People fucking love
course,
the
because
idea
every
of having
homeowner
their,
gets a
yep,
deduction, itemize their taxes,
exactly.
all that dumb shit.
So the problem is you can't really repeal it. Like that's not a politically actionable thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So this is where I took the suggestion of sort of abolishing the mortgage interest deduction and using it to fund Section 8 and combining it with something called a conditional mortgage interest deduction. So the idea is you have what's left, which would be like, I don't know, $29 billion worth of mortgage interest deduction. You could shift this downward so that it's more progressive, so that it's impacting like middle class people, low income people, just to sort of maintain it as a thing that exists and also maintain like the small amount of good that it
Mm-hmm.
could be considered to be doing. But here's the way that the conditional mortgage interest deduction works, which I think is really interesting. So you cap the mortgage interest deduction. So you take the 29 billion that you have left, and you cap it. So you don't make it just like an unlimited amount, and then you lift the cap for homeowners in counties where you have an inelastic housing supply or high prices. So essentially, in places that are like really fucked in terms of zoning, or places that aren't fucked in terms of zoning, so places that have like good zoning regulation, you lift that cap. So only the places that have fucked up zoning have a mortgage interest deduction cap, and then you rebate the savings that aren't funneled directly into HCVs back into local communities in exchange for sustained housing construction. Kind of like what Sanders was saying with the zoning incentives. So the idea is that you have a cap that exists if you have really punishing zoning laws,
Regulate
and then you
me.
eliminate that cap when they start to build a lot of housing, and you provide them some of the savings that you're getting back from capping it in other areas to help them build houses and subsidize the housing construction that they pursue. So in this way, you are much more directly influencing the abolition
Mm-hmm.
of zoning regulation. And then just some other notions, take all the project-based vouchers and make them into tenant-based vouchers. So you want people to sort of be able to specifically choose where they live. And here's another interesting thing. You should take the HCV rent ceilings, so like the proportion that the government is going to pay out of a given rent, and then you should index it to neighborhood incomes. So the idea is that um, the ceiling is the amount up to which the government will pay after the recipient pays their portion. And if you peg this to neighborhood incomes, you're not going to be like restricting mobility as much. So people are going to be able to move around and sort of more efficiently allocate themselves in terms of labor market, in terms of housing, and that kind of thing. And this empirically has caused people to move into safer and less impoverished neighborhoods at essentially no net cost to the government because of the sort of benefit that is accrued by allowing people to more efficiently allocate themselves in that way. And the benefits of this kind of movement are really substantial for the future incomes of young children. I think a really big thing is that you want to improve the mobility of lower income individuals, allowing them to shift, to whichever sort of municipality that they want to live in, and having the ability to take a housing choice voucher and cash it in wherever they want, and sort of make make that independent of troubles that they might experience with higher neighborhood incomes. I think would be a really positive thing. So this is all like really kind of complicated, sounded really wonky. And one of the things that I kind of try to say like conscious about is that sometimes people on the left will say like, oh, hey, look at that policy wonk with his little tinkering of like EITC benefits or whatever, and it's like a whole meme over there. So I think it's really valuable if you can take a complicated proposal like this and boil it down into something that's really simple. So I know I kind of talk fast. I hope that was vaguely understandable, but the way I would summarize this is essentially you are making rich people pay for their houses, and then you're using the savings to give people money to live wherever they want, and you give some of that money to communities to build more houses for people to live in. So essentially, you're taking the money that rich people receive that subsidizes their housing consumption,
Mm-hmm.
and you give it to people so they can live wherever they want, and then you make it so the places where they want to live can actually build more houses for them to live in. Um,
Okay.
so that's the basic idea. A few other just random things to consider. Potentially, you might want like state level minimum zoning mandates. So you have an idea where like a state like California passes something that says any landowner can build at a state guaranteed minimum density, even in a municipality that might be like sort of more resistant to development. Is an interesting idea. Instead of community development block grants, you could tie transportation grants to zoning reform, since these are going to be more broadly applicable even to very wealthy cities. And then just a final thing, his stuff about education funding afterwards. I think there were like a few clips when he was going over with the serfs, and he was like looking and he was like saying, oh, I don't think that this graph actually demonstrates what he was saying. The confusion there is essentially that federal spending has grown since the recession, but state spending has fallen. So the problem that we experience in higher education is essentially a collapse of state spending, while federal spending has sort of been forced to flow in to meet that gap. So in that sense, I guess you were kind of both right. Okay. And yeah, I guess that's it. Sorry, that was kind of a long and boring ramble, but there you go. That's the deal.
Gotcha.
TLDR, I don't think that he was right about universal versus means-tested programs. I don't think that Bernie Sanders' public housing plan appropriately addresses the shortfalls of rent control, and I think that there are more effective and more cost-effective ways of dealing with the challenges presented by a sort of rigid housing market.
Okay.
There you go.
Thanks. I appreciate it, bud.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Have fun. Be careful. Destiny. Click. Oh, I saw this.
Oh my. Oh. That is shameless. Listen.
Okay. That is pretty shameless. Let's be real.
Stop intimidating.
Okay, that was pretty dumb.
Oh!
Wait, what happened? Oh.
Drown out the noise. I don't give a shit. Where's the kid at? Throw him out the window. Let's go. Where is he? Move it, move it. Get that kid. Throw him out. Hold on, we're switching up. Okay, we're inside. Tactical.
Riley is nearly killed.
What are these?
Round the clock medical care.
Hey, yo, fuck that baby.
Get the fuck out.
And his uncle.
Fucking lion-ass baby. That's a lion-ass baby, dude. Get the fuck out of here, baby, with your lies.
The clip, Hassan's volume needed to be turned up like twice as much, but otherwise, yeah, it was pretty good. 10 out of 10 meme. We saw this earlier. This meme was so good. Holy shit.
Right.
What a fucking...
Oh, shit. Oh, man.
Excuse me. Do you mind? Everywhere else is full. Not at all. I'm Ron, by the way. Ron Weasley.
What a fucking Weasley...
I was about to say, like, this meme is shit. Like, this doesn't even make sense. I think this whole, you know how some people theorize, it's really dumb. The conspiracy theory, like maybe humans were put on Earth just to make plastic for the planet and then it's going to destroy us. I feel like this whole fucking meme shit, all this bullshit over the past few days was literally just to deliver us this one golden meme. God damn.
$10 million to play an MMO that I don't like for 1 year, I would not do it. I promise you. I will kill myself if I'm lying. If somehow I would actually not do it. I fucking swear. And there's just no one ever believes me when I say that, but it's true.
What a fucking liar, dude.
I really wouldn't do it.
What a fucking Weasley
Thanks,
little
Central.
liar, dude. What a fucking Weasley little
That's a lie.
liar,
It's
dude.
not a fucking lie.
Holy
You fucking
shit,
cunt.
dude.
Fuck you.
Holy fucking
I'm not
shit,
fucking lying.
dude. Literally
Fucking hate when
lying.
people think I'm lying, man.
Still lying.
10.
Okay, all right, we're done. Chill.